Welcome to Cyber Insecurity, brought to you by eLearn Security. I'm Matt Kreischer, content specialist at eLearn Security, and as always, I am joined by Neil Bridges and Jeff Goals. Neil is a cybersecurity veteran of both the Cyber Command at the U.S. Air Force and Fortune 100 companies, as well as Price Waterhouse Cooper. He's currently consulting through his company Root Access Protection. Jeff is a named account manager with VMware Carbon Black. He has more than 30 years experience in the technology and cybersecurity sectors, helping clients around the world achieve first-class security protocols. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you as always.
Glad to be here.
So we're going to start with a couple consumer products. One that hit close to home for me as a cyclist. This past weekend, I woke up on Saturday morning to plan my Saturday bike ride and found that Garmin's website, Garmin Connect, as well as their phishing sites were all down. And we learned later that that was due to a Wasted Locker ransomware attack. On top of that, GED Match, the DNA investigative service that is linked to several DNA companies like 23andMe and Ancestry.com. They also suffered a compromise recently that may have opened up sensitive DNA files to hackers. Both companies are consumer products that rely heavily on customer goodwill and public relations. In the case of Garmin, the company did not admit to the ransomware taking place until after the ransom was allegedly paid and their servers were back online. And with GED Match, an opt-out service that allows consumers to hide their DNA from law enforcement officers was temporarily disabled. So, Neil and Jeff, how do you think both companies handled these attacks?
I definitely got to admit, it sounds like Garmin lost the way to their patching server. I could not wait to do that joke. I could not wait to do a Garmin joke.
For those listening,
they just couldn't find it. Nice, Neil.
They just couldn't find it.
For those listening, it landed like a lead balloon.
No, we
were actually looking at your face as you were saying it, and that's really the reason we were laughing. That's the only reason, Neil.
I'm good with that. I'm good with that. Like I've been leading up to this. Like ever since Matt sent out the topics, I'm like, I'm doing a Garmin joke.
You know, you're entering the part of the show that I'm supposed to be. If we're going to depend on me for cyber like intelligence and deep dive, we're in trouble. So stay in your lane, dude.
What I do want to look at is not necessarily the deep dive, but really how, especially Garmin, responded to the attack, because it seemed like they were either ignoring it online or deliberately trying to kind of punt down the road until the articles came out that showed that they were hacked.
Actually, I think call me the conspiracy theorist on this one, right? But if you look at it, there was an OFAC article. So the Office of Jeff's the money guy, like the Office of something illegal, right?
That's the official name.
That's the official name, right? Right. I mean, if they truly did get hit with ransomware, and I think it was pretty substantial, and they knew that they were going to have to pay the ransom, they perhaps were probably realistically holding on to this release pending the legal team, authorizing them to talk about it or having some type of law enforcement, come in and be a joint partnership to work with them on it. Because if they were going to have to pay a multi-million-dollar ransom to an organization like Evil Corp that is on the OFAC list, I can't imagine the amount of red tape and hoops that they would have had to jump through to do that.
And this brings up a major quandary right now. I mean, every company out there that is dealing with, what do we do if and when, right? And it's more a matter of when at this point, because I think pretty much anyone who knows what they're doing in security knows that it's really a matter of when.
What?
But I mean, it depends on the situation, how bad it is, and what you do as a company.
I think you bring up a really good point, because when I was at PwC, and I don't know if this is still PwC's stance or not, so I'm not speaking for PwC in this, right? But they were consulting folks at the time on a very, very strict no pay basis. And so when I went to go work for one of the follow-on Fortune 100 companies that I went to go work for, and we were advising, the CISO and the CIO on a pay no pay strategy as part of their incident response playbook. They were actually, when we advised them on a no pay strategy, they were like, I'm telling you, if the CEO's computer gets ransomwared right before they go to the street to announce earnings, they'll pay whatever it takes to get that computer
Right.
unlocked so they've got earnings.
Well, and this is not we're going to hold fast to our scruples, and we're not going to pay a ransom. We're going to hold that stance right until we go out of business. I mean,
Right.
At the end of the day, Garmin had to get back up and running, and I think what's a more interesting story is the hacked DNA, because I personally think that consumers don't care about security because it never affects them. But Garmin does, like to your point, Matt, it affected you this weekend, albeit, okay, it just meant that you didn't have perfect tracking of the bike ride that you were already going to do.
You couldn't get your exact speed stats off that Garmin,
and still haven't gotten them yet, actually. So, but
you were going really, really, really fast. That's all I know.
Let me elaborate on that a little bit, though, especially with Garmin, is that Garmin does have a major competitor in Wahoo. Now, Wahoo has made strides to, push against Garmin and be their main competitor. And, if I'm on Wahoo's, marketing department, I'm calling, my boss and saying, hey, this is an opportunity to talk about like taking down our biggest competitor or making inroads against our biggest competitor and exploiting that, because security, while it doesn't affect the consumer per se, the word security, especially from a marketing standpoint, is extraordinarily important because it is a buzzword and it's something that you can actually put, concrete evidence behind if you're Garmin's biggest competitor.
But if I'm CISO, I'm going to the CIO and the CFO and going, this could be us next if we're not careful.
Well, absolutely. Sure. And I mean, you take a look at the attack and you're like, okay, this could have happened to anyone. Are we sure we want to put our name out there in lights saying, hey, this didn't happen to us. It happened to someone that doesn't care about you as much as we do. You should come use our service instead. I think part of this is the fact that, okay, what is the worst case scenario as a consumer of Garmin? Well, you didn't get your speed stats.
Well, no. See,
but DNA is a different story.
I
think that is going to be a much more interesting piece as all of this unfolds for the consumers to say, gee, my DNA is something that I can't get back. I can lose my bike ride data, but sorry, Matt.
No,
but I can't change my DNA.
Here's where I would disagree with that, though, Jeff, because one of the little known parts about the Garmin hack that people aren't talking about, right, is, the pilot's ability to file flight plans and use Garmin data, which is part of an FAA regulation to ensure safe flight, was also impacted by this. And so, this is only a hop, skip, and a jump away from actually impacting potentially, flights that were in air that potentially could have had a pretty huge, I would call a pretty huge consumer impact.
And also think of everybody.
I think the flight plan thing isn't necessarily consumer. That's an enterprise discussion of, great, I can't use this. Now what do I do? They're still going to have to file a flight plan. They're just going to have to go back to the quote unquote difficult way of doing it before they had an easy app.
Yeah.
Because before Garmin happened, people were still filing flight plans. It was just more difficult and manual.
Yeah, but take something away from somebody that makes their job easier.
That's true.
Then that's where things get a little hairy and a little interesting. I do want to talk a little bit about the DNA thing, because there is this interesting privacy issue with DNA being out there now. Conceivably, what are the risks inherent with having your DNA out on the internet?
People can make clones of you.
Nice. There's no risk. There's no risk of that for us, man.
Last week I was feisty. This week I'm a smart ass.
Yeah, exactly. So no, but if you take a look at risk factors of me as a consumer, right? I do 23andMe, and I'm not calling them out per se, but I'm not feeling like I'm in jeopardy of getting convicted of a crime that I did 40 years ago, and shoot, my DNA. I know I see you on video not believing me, but I swear it's true. But where it does hit me is gee, I'm 50 plus years old, and what if I want to go get health insurance or whatever, and my DNA is out there, and some insurance company can buy all of these DNA records and vet that against, hey, these are genetic markers for a higher probability of heart disease or brain tumors or whatever. You're uninsurable, right? And so it does impact us.
So let me ask you this from a hypothetical situation, because we criminally charge individuals who have access to hacked data, or in some cases we've talked about, having criminal charges to folks who have access to hacked data. And Lord knows it's been a gray area from a legal standpoint for the last few years, or since doxing and things like that have been a huge deal. Are you suggesting then that maybe corporations like insurance companies who have access to hacked 23andMe data, should not use that, or should face some type of SEC penalty for?
I do.
Yeah.
I think that the answer to that in
that's
practice,
the difficult part.
I think the answer to that in practice is going to be depending on how good your legal team is, though.
My legal team's terrible.
Is it
I need a new legal team.
Is it mad?
It is.
You stayed at a Holiday Inn Express 8 months ago before quarantine.
Before we move on to the next topic, I would just recommend the movie Gattaca, because it seems like Jeff is getting very close to the plot of that with this discussion.
That's really about all of my thinking comes from movies.
That's also all his knowledge on cyber comes from movies.
Yeah,
exactly. Everything that Jeff knows came from the 1994 movie The Net with Sandra Bullock.
Yeah. Oh, that was a good movie.
Case in point.
Exactly.
Okay, moving on to Russia, where we tend to hang out much these days. Fancy Bear, which is Russia's GRU hacking group, and they're also the organization responsible for the 2016 hacking and leaking campaign that struck the DNC. They're once again making headlines. Wired reported earlier this week that a previously unreported campaign by Fancy Bear to target U.S. government organizations and the American energy sector has been ongoing since 2018. Neil, the FBI claims that there's currently no clear motive for the attacks. So I'm wondering, is this just Russia being Russia, or should the security sector be concerned with what's been going on in the past 2 years in a way that they weren't already?
I don't think those questions are mutually exclusive, of each other. I think that it is Russia being Russia, and I think the cybersecurity community should absolutely be worried about it. And I think there's some interesting conversations that happen around this circle of like Russia targeting literally anybody, whether it's vaccine makers, energy sector, whatever the case is, because these are private businesses, right? And if we say Russia has attacked energy sector, power company X, or energy business X, or some type of private entity like that, or even a vaccine maker, who their entire livelihood is built around trying to find this vaccine for COVID-19, right? How do you, as a nation, as a United States nation, right, rationalize that you have a nation state attacking a private business? And where's that gray area between this being a nation state attack and espionage versus, a cybercrime and just normal cybercrime activity? And where do you get involved? Where do you have that separation of government responsibilities and private organization responsibilities? And so I think that it's more about what happens in the circle around this conversation than anything else.
Well, but you're thinking like an American thinks. I mean, we think in silos. It's either government or it's personal, it's business, and they're separated. These attacks that we're seeing from Russia and China, they're not necessarily separated. They don't see as clear a distinction as we do.
But that's my point, though, right? Is that we go Russia attack business, right, or China attack business, and so we don't have that distinction, and so as a result, it's hard to look at those attacks and say, well, if we're going to blame Russia, is this a nation state activity, Or are we going to say that it's this criminal organization, this particular hacker that, is working inside of Russia, and therefore we have a face and a name to it that's actually going to it? Instead, we're going to say GRU and blame it on the entire government and say that, it's a nation state. It's all about trying, not to say that Russia doesn't do these activities, but it's still propaganda in saying that, we should be fearful of Russia, hacking us. And the cybersecurity community has known for a long time. I mean, again, if you listen to me here on this podcast or on my streams or anything else like that in lectures and everything, I'm like, hey, there is a very, very small distinction between, GRU and somebody running Black Hole or Eleanor back in the day at the Russian Business Network. But we don't do a good enough job of trying to say, okay, GRU is attacking Business X, and Business X, by the way, you've got to stand ready to defend yourself against a nation state attacker. The government's not going to help you with that.
Yeah, but actually, I think it's unfair because it's kind of like, the little guy as an enterprise security team is up against the bullies, right? Mm-hmm. You've got an unfair attack coming from a nation state to an individual company who's not prepared to defend like a country would be able to defend. I think that our government needs to actually take a little bit different stance on how these nation states or individuals acting within a nation state are attacking these enterprises, because they're literally stealing our intellectual property and going to truly create a major devastating problem for some of these companies that are, you take a look at COVID vaccine, they're all in. If they don't make a profit because of this, they are potentially going out of business.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because I think that when we start looking at the concept of Russia or China, right? I mean, those organizations are trying to prove how much better they are than the U.S. on a day in and day out basis. And so, yes, if they can hack in, I mean, they don't make a distinction. And I know it's not on our list of topics to talk about today, but I know that we chatted about it amongst the three of us, right? Those two Chinese hackers who were recently indicted by the U.S., they weren't directly employed by the PLA. They weren't PLA uniformed or anything like that. They were, civilian hackers that were asked by the government to do hacking operations on behalf of the Chinese government.
And if you happen to ruin some entity in the U.S., cool. 2 thumbs up. Well done, guys.
Right, exactly. And if you don't do it, by the way, we're going to put a bullet in your head.
Oh, there's that.
There's that.
So, let me ask you this to follow up on something you said earlier. What does that change in stance from the U.S. government look like if you're a hospital in a medium-sized city that is trying to protect their personal data from, a nation-state attack? How does that change in stance help the IT team or the CISO in that organization?
So in a complete and total pipe dream universe, because this will never happen in our democracy, and this isn't a bash against our democracy whatsoever, right? But there needs to be open intelligence lines between the intelligence community that the United States government employs. So like, Director of National Intelligence, NSA, CIA, right? And if there is an imminent threat, so very similar to like, the US Cyber Command, going to Twitter about this F5 vulnerability, I can almost bet you a steak dinner somewhere, right, or a nice bottle of red wine, that they knew that vulnerability was being exploited for months, if not years, prior to that, right? We need to keep backing that up, and we need to keep backing that transparency up on that type of intelligence, so that not just the hospitals, but people who have security operations teams can get intelligence in an actionable fashion, in a quick fashion, to be able to defend themselves against those types of attacks. Instead, and I've been on the recipient of this multiple times, where I get a phone call from the FBI, where the FBI shows up in my office and they're like, I can't tell you anything, but here's a piece of paper with an IP address on it. Need you to go look through your logs and see if you see anything regarding that IP address. So there's a severe lack of transparency because our democracy doesn't allow for that transparency between the intelligence community and the private sector.
But I think there are programmatical things that could be
Please
done.
Don't say InfraGard.
No. I'm talking about the NSA and CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Agency, put out what I think is a pretty good roadmap, right? And Matt, I'm probably stealing a little bit of your thunder.
Steal away.
Okay. But, they literally talked about operating technologies, the OT environment that needs to be patched, and some critical pieces of exposure that need to be addressed. And they laid out a pretty decent roadmap for what should be done. It doesn't detail all of the things, but it talks about a 6-step process here of
Jeff, why don't we go ahead and move on to that subject then and kind of, wrap it into this one. And what Jeff is referring to is the NSA and Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency released an advisory.
Say that again, really fast.
No. CISA, which I will not
there you go,
released an advisory on July 23rd relating to critical infrastructure operational technology. And like Jeff said, they implemented they released a 6-step plan. This is a firm structure of implementation. But essentially they're warning private industry that nation state actors are willing to exploit companies to destabilize, national security. So, Jeff, I do kind of I didn't want to cut you off, but I do want to kind of morph into talking about this framework in the way that we were discussing Russia.
But in the framework, real quick though, before you do that, Jeff, and I know you're looking for the soapbox so you can stand back on it. I see that look on your face. I don't think a framework.
I'm already on it, by the way.
I know, I could tell, and it's like
muted.
No, I'm going to kick this one. I'm going to kick this one out from under you. Frameworks are not the same as information sharing, right? And in that framework, it doesn't talk about
that.
Yeah. What? Holy? Did we?
I know.
We're recording on that one, right?
I agree with you.
So the framework is.
That part out.
Well, yeah, I figured as much.
I'll send you a check.
Yeah, but when you ask like what could be done, Matt, I think it's really about that information sharing. I mean, the government's been putting out frameworks for years. What do you think NIST is, right? I mean, NIST is a perfect example of a framework that the government's been putting out. And, they've even NERC has tried to force energy companies to regulate against NIST. CMMC, the DoD contractors are now being held to, is based largely off of CIS 20 and NIST as well. But frameworks aren't the same as getting intelligence to decision makers faster.
And it should be said that NIST has seen success. I mean, a lot of companies take that framework in how they build their IT or their security teams.
Are you saying that NIST hasn't done a good thing by raising the watermark?
I have not said that NIST has not done a good thing. What I've said is that a framework doesn't get information to decision makers quickly enough to defend against attacks. NIST is a strategy. Intelligence is actionable data on the battlefield.
Totally agree.
If we're talking about Russia and North Korea and China, and we have actionable intelligence at the highest levels of our government that's saying that Russia is hacking into this hospital or this clinic right now to steal this vaccine, that is intelligence that some security team could use to stop that attack.
But you're talking about this from a very, very focused lens perspective.
How so?
Hey, we've got an active threat right now. You need to go look at this IP address, for instance, from the FBI, right? That's a very, very finely focused target that you need to go investigate. Very, very, small scope of what you need to do, right? What I'm talking about is, we as a government see the vulnerability within OT and legacy operating systems being a major problem. We think you need to, go bolster your security on those things. So what they've done here is provided kind of a targeted recommendation to raise the water level of security around our country by saying, hey, here's a framework of how you should go about doing this. I agree that a framework is not necessarily the be-all, end-all, and it doesn't solve world hunger. What it does do, however, is it allows for the common security practitioner to understand what our government is saying is a prioritized threat, right? It's a prioritized area of focus within the legacy operating systems of OT, and you need to do the following things in order to bolster the security of those things. Once you do that, move on to the second thing. What I would love to see is the government say, okay, here's a primary, secondary, tertiary kind of list of what should be addressed. in order.
With all due respect, I think you and I are saying the same thing, which is oftentimes the case. We're oftentimes attacking the same problem.
Well, let's argue it.
Let's argue it anyway, right? I'm going to argue with you.
Does that mean you owe me the wine and steak dinner?
No, because we both still disagree because I'm arguing with you on it.
For everybody listening, I'm actually wearing a referee's jersey right now.
I agree in sense that a framework is a strategy, right? But as with cyber, right? Let's call a spade, right? Cyber war is happening every day. Every incident response team that is listening to this, every CISO that is listening to this right now, they have an incident response team that is on the front lines conducting cyber warfare right now every day on a day-to-day basis. They are fighting against the bad guys every day.
I don't disagree with that, but how many organizations have you talked to who don't have a resiliency plan already identified for their OT? They don't have an exercisable incident response plan. They don't have an ability to harden that environment and to identify and vet out those vulnerabilities. How many of those organizations are not even doing the basic blocking and tackling that the government has already said, okay, according to our active threats, you need to go do that. So if they're not doing that, then they need to refocus on doing some of these things, because they literally just came out and said, NSA said, hey, we see this as a major problem, i.e. go solve it, because this is probably your number one vulnerability in your organization.
And make no mistake, I do truly believe that what NSA and CISA are trying to do is they're trying to figure out ways to communicate to private business in a way that doesn't compromise the channels that the intelligence community has. But I still argue that you've got two different tracks, right? You have the strategic track, which does say that, yes, day in and day out, or from a strategic perspective, you have to figure out a way to solve your OT problems. You've got to solve for legacy operating systems, for PLCs that are doing ladder logic that can't even handle an Nmap scan, let alone any of these other heavy traffic loads or things like this on a network. Yes, strategically you have to figure that out. But I think what is also missing is this concept that we have cyber activity that's happening day in and day out. And so tactically, with the boots on the ground, there needs to be a better mechanism for getting actionable intelligence to the boots on the ground so that they can actively defend against threats. Because if you look at Garmin, look at Twitter when we have the Twitter conversation, look at any other cyber attack that's out there, and without calling too many companies out specifically by name, most of them were probably in the midst of their cybersecurity strategy. They probably had a 3-year to 5-year plan, or were at least in part on their way on a 3 to 5 year plan of doing something from a cybersecurity perspective.
And then they did a right turn to say, oh, hey, we need to reformat all of this in the NIST framework way of thinking so that we can tell our board, oh yeah, we're already doing this.
Well, but there's that, but then they also have to make a right turn as well, because then they get hit with a cyber attack, right? Because they didn't get a piece of intelligence that if they had gotten 24 hours before, they probably could have stopped the cyber attack.
Yeah, so ideally what you're talking about is great. Raise the watermark of your vulnerable environments and do the recommendations that the government lays out for us. And then what would be really nice is to have a line of communication from the intelligence community into each security product of each organization to ingest that new threat intelligence so that they're proactive instead of reactive.
Or use
ideally an RSS feed of things going on.
Or use an ISAC, right? Or use one of the information sharing organizations like FSI.
I was just going to say, doesn't this already exist?
But they don't get the feed. They don't get actionable intelligence. They rely on community-based intelligence, right? I've been in FSISAC and NHISAC and NERC ISAC and things like that, and they all rely on each other in the community. And then the tough part about that, and we had this challenge with one of the healthcare companies that I worked at before, was getting our legal team to agree that it was okay for us to share intelligence that we were seeing on our network, so that it didn't have any potential legal ramifications on it. So there's like multiple layers that even the community has to deal with.
So we started this with Garmin probably having to delay things because of lawyers, and now we're coming right back to lawyers again. So I'm seeing a theme.
Dude, it's where things tend to go. So since we're on this theme of how nation-state attacks affect private industry, I want to move on to the Lazarus Group. So the Lazarus Group is connected to North Korea. They have developed a new malware framework that they're using to infiltrate corporate networks and steal sensitive data. The security firm Kaspersky first reported what they are now calling the MATA framework. And then SecureList published a handy visualization of how MATA is organized. It reminds me of almost like a corporate infrastructure with developers and packers acting as the top level C-suite and delivering downstream products and information to red teams, bot masters, and support. It also seems like an organization built on plausible deniability, with each silo only contacting the teams that they're working with directly. So, Neil, are you impressed? Are you scared? Are you a bit of both, or none of the above?
Is it anti-nationalist for me to like clap at North Korea and be like, welcome to, at least 5 years ago worth of hacking frameworks? I mean, this is an organization where, maybe I'm showing a little bit too much from our side in the military, but when I was working in U.S. Cyber Command, it was no joke. We laughed at North Korea, and we've laughed at North Korea as they've grown up in the hacking business. And I'm using my air quotes there for folks who can't see me, just because of their continued lack of sophistication. And on top of that, you could tell that their motives are almost 100% financially driven. The sanctions have forced them into attacking things like the Bangladeshi, SWIFT payment system, where, they almost made away with $1 billion, which isn't something to shy about. But, I think even a lot of the work that they're doing now, I think I saw a new report on Lazarus Group where they're targeting, MageCart, which again is like a 3 to 5 year old, TTP that skimmers were using to steal credit card information off of payment card websites and things like that. So, their entire methodology is around getting money into the kingdom because they're under heavy sanctions. So, congratulations for getting with the rest of us.
So one thing I'll say on that though is that while they are behind with their motivation being financial, this is important for private industry, especially in the United States. I mean, North Korea might not be able to deploy a full nation state attack against another country, but with people lacking the proper patches with vulnerabilities and everything, it does present, that new sophistication does present dangers for American companies.
Yeah, I mean, I think I see Jeff wanted to chime in there. I think the only thing I would add to that is I use the lack of sophistication to say that the companies that haven't been able to stop modern ransomware attacks, probably aren't any more prepared to stop something, as immature as Lazarus Group.
What I find interesting about this article is the fact that this is no different than just a normal organization. What is very different, though, is how the different divisions, the ones coming up with the ransomware itself, the packers, the people who are posting it and finding the way in, and the social engineers, et cetera, and then the people coming away with the actual ransomware success, right? The analyst who's stealing the documents, or how they're going to monetize this. All of those individuals are very, very siloed. So yes, it's an organization, but it's an organization, like you were talking, plausible deniability. It seems like they've got their one area of expertise, and then they hand it off to the next group, and they don't have any clue where it goes from there, right? And so what's interesting is there's some master plan to come up with how this organization will go from point A to point Z, and there's 25 steps along the way in order for this to be successful, and each one is doing their job really, really well, because that's all they do. It's an assembly line.
I think what you're talking about, and I think, and maybe I went a little too cynical right off the bat, which is not uncommon for me, right? But I would agree with you, and I'm glad, and we got this one on tape too. We're gonna have to tally up all the times that either one of us say that we agree with each other. When you look at, and maybe Matt, I don't know if it's possible in the podcast or not to include the link of the one that we're talking about so people can see the chart that we're referencing. But the chart that we're referencing, really talks about a level of compartmentalization that when you look at any nation state, like the United States is no exception to that rule, right? You've got U.S. Cyber Command, you've got logistics, you've got even if you look at the forces, right, where the Army usually handles like ground forces and base buildups, and the Marines are like the troops on the front line. You've got Air Command for the Air Force and things like that, where you have compartmentalization. Nobody really knows what everybody else is doing or what everybody else's mission is, but from a higher level joint force commander perspective, they're pushing down strategy to task to the individual battlefield commanders. And I think that's what that picture really articulates, right, is that you have compartmentalization happening inside the Lazarus Group, whereby nobody knows what it is everybody else has got going on.
But this aligns to our earlier conversation that all of these attacks are run like a military organization. It's an operation that is a nation state by design, right? Whether they are or aren't. And the reality is you've got all of these different groups that are focused on working together without knowing what each other is doing, right?
Well, and in some of my talks that I've given in the past, where I talk about like Neil's levels of hackers, right, where I talk about level 1 being script kiddies, level 2 being cyber criminals, and level 3 kind of being equal to the state-sponsored attackers, I make the distinction that between level 2 and level 3 isn't writing 0 days. It isn't.
It's organizational.
It's organizational. It's having strategy to task. And that's really, and so what, if anything, what I would say is that, Lazarus Group, North Korea, is graduating finally out of level 2 and maybe into that bottom part of level 3 where they actually have a true, joint force, military strategy task type organization that's going on for them.
But don't you think that as they get further evolved and now that they've got this organizational structure, that they're going to get a lot more sophisticated just because the developers are just doing development. They're not doing anything else other than that. And that's their area of expertise. And the analyst doesn't have to worry about any of that stuff. So they focus on how to turn whatever information they're gathering into a more monetizable, commodity. Right. And so you've got, the levels of sophistication, I think, are not just in the levels of attack, but it's how they can leverage that attack into something that's worth more money.
I completely agree, and it's been awesome over my career, right, to watch. Not to sound like
it's been awesome to watch North Korea just get so much better.
It is, because I'm telling you, I watched them when they were getting caught day in and day out because they were using the Metasploit framework, which is publicly available. Like anybody in the world can go out, download Metasploit, and start trying to hack stuff with Metasploit today, right? I watched them go from that to now they have a strategy to task compartmentalization structure. You're absolutely right. I think I would say 5 years, right? Maybe less, maybe 2.5, right? Just because I think once you hit a certain strategy, task, or organizational structure, you really start to skyrocket on your capabilities.
So that was where I was going with this question, though. I mean, right now they're just starting to hit mainstream, if you will, on capability. Yeah. How soon before we're talking about North Korea, who now has a ton of motivation? I mean, China has a lot of motivation just because they hate us. Yeah. North Korea hates us even more, and they're desperately in need of money.
I think
how long?
I think the money part is what's going to hold them back, though, right? Because with the advances that SWIFT is making after their Bangladeshi attack, and some of the stuff that's happening in the anti-money laundering laws and things like that, I think North Korea then has to channel their internal creative side to try to figure out ways to bypass, some of the financial.
So it's that laundering that's going to stop them.
Yeah, exactly. It's that laundry that's going to stop them. And if you actually look, some of their attacks not only have been targeting like the Bangladeshi bank, they've been targeting cryptocurrency exchanges.
Yeah, and that solves that problem.
That solves that problem, right? They can start to launder money through cryptocurrencies and things like that. So I think if anything, if they get more advanced on the organizational front, that's fine. I'd be curious / interested to see what type of loopholes, if they can channel their inner creativity, they can find in the financial system.
Well, it sounds like interesting days are ahead with North Korea kind of gaining in sophistication, and especially if they're going to keep targeting American companies. Gentlemen, that's our show today. If you
but I got more questions.
Save them for next week, Jeff.
Okay.
For the latest episodes, subscribe to INE's The IT Experts Network, wherever you get your podcasts, or check out eLearn Security's YouTube page. And I will include the link to the article on the Matter framework that Neil was referencing earlier. So if you're listening, go ahead and check that out as well. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.